Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Sunday morning worship service brought to you from the sanctuary here at the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of York. I'm Steve Converse, and I will be helping to lead our service today. This service is a follow-on from last Sunday's powerful Memorial Day service that was led by our members Erica Caldwell and Steve Snell. Today we will celebrate peacemongers, the unsung activists whose work is an example of the work we might do to make the world a more peaceful place. I've been a member of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of York since 1985. My two children grew up in this church, and I believe got the grounding in concepts of comparative religion and Unitarian Universalist principles and values that have grounded them ethically and served them well in raising their own children. My wife Karen and I treasure our faith community here. The moving and thought-provoking sermons on Sunday mornings, the RE program that serves our young families with children, as well as the beautiful physical space of this sanctuary, and the remarkable green campus we maintain and share with the larger community. We're particularly active in the community garden, the annual fundraising auction, and helping at special events, such as the wonderful memorial service held here yesterday morning. I have enjoyed tuning in on Sundays during the pandemic hiatus, taking in the service each week while sitting at the window, watching the birds in our garden and the changing light of the seasons. But I'm also very much looking forward to being back here in person with all of you very soon. Our mission here at UUCY is to be a transformational faith community that serves the religious and spiritual needs of a wide and diverse group of people, a community that earns recognition as a leader in the work of social justice and guides our children to become more engaged global citizens. As is customary whenever Unitarian Universalists gather together, we begin by lighting a candle in our chalice. Our candle flame represents the flaming chalice that is the symbol of the living tradition of our faith. We also invite everyone at home to light a candle as we share our chalice lighting words. Those words today are from the Great Lesson written by Olympia Brown. Olympia Brown was ordained in Malone, New York on June 25, 1863 as a Universalist minister by the Northern Universalist Association. She was the first woman in the United States to be ordained with full denominational authority. We can never make the world safe by fighting. Every nation must learn that the people of all nations are children of God and must share the wealth of the world. You may say this is impracticable, far away, can never be accomplished, but it is the work we are appointed to do. Sometime, somehow, somewhere, we must ever teach the great lesson.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of York Sunday morning worship. Welcome, welcome again. My name is Reverend Terry Cummings, and I use she, her pronouns. It seems like just yesterday I was here among so many of you in this worship sanctuary. And actually, it was just yesterday that I was here with so many of you, and what a meaningful celebration of life we had for our 4 dear members who died in this past year. Today is the 77th anniversary of the D-Day landings in Normandy, France. And I thought that it would be important to follow up on the wonderful service from last Sunday that was dedicated to the memory of those who serve and those who work for peace by dedicating today's service for peace, and particularly for the peacemakers, those unsung heroes who work tirelessly for peace behind the scenes. And I begin our service today with some words of gathering. They are a poem by Mary Oliver. The Eskimos have no word for war. Trying to explain it to them leaves one feeling ridiculous and obscene. They listen politely and stride away, with spears and sleds and barking dogs to hunt for food. Later, by burning fires and boiling bones, in steaming kettles, they welcome me to share what they have in a hungry time, in a difficult land, while I talk on of southern kingdoms, cannon, armies, shifting alliances, airplanes, power. They chew their bones and smile at one another. Mary Oliver. Please join in singing or enjoying our opening hymn, Vine and Fig Tree.
Old Joe lived way out in the countryside, and he had one good neighbor. They'd been friends all their lives. It seemed that they'd grown old together. And now that their spouses were dead and buried, and their children raised and living lives of their own in other places, all they had left were their farms and each other. But for the first time in their long relationship, they had an argument. And it was a silly argument. It was over a stray calf that neither one really needed. It seemed as though the calf was found on Joe's neighbor's land, and so he claimed it for his own. But old Joe said, "Oh, no, no! That calf has the same markings as my favorite cow, and I recognize it as being mine." Well, they're both a bit stubborn, so the upshot of it all was that they just stopped talking to each other. And that happened about a week before, and it seemed that a dark cloud had settled over old Joe. Until there came a knock on his door. He wasn't expecting anyone that morning, and as he opened the door, he saw standing before him a young man who had a box of wooden tools on his shoulder. He had a kind voice and rather dark, deep eyes, and he said, I'm just a carpenter, and I'm looking for a bit of work. Maybe you'd have some small jobs here and there that I could help with." Now, old Joe wasn't the kind of fella to take someone on right away, so he brought him into the kitchen and sat him down and gave him some stew that he had had on the back of the stove. There was some fresh homemade bread that had baked earlier that morning, some fresh churned butter, and some homemade jam. And while they were sitting and eating and talking, Joe decided that he liked this young fellow, and he said, "You know what? I do have a job for you. Look right there through my kitchen window. See that farm over there across the way? That's my neighbor's place. That creek that runs between our property lines, that was not there last week. My neighbor did it just to spite me. He took his plow up there with a tractor and he dug a big old furrow from the upper pond and then he flooded it. Well, I want you to do one better. Since he wants us divided that way, you go out there and build me a fence. A big, tall fence, so I won't even have to see his place anymore." And the carpenter said, "Well, if you have the lumber and the nails, I have my tools, and I can definitely do a job for you like that." So Joe had to go on to town to get some supplies, so he hitched up the wagon and showed the carpenter where everything was in the barn. And that carpenter, well, he carried everything he needed down to the creek, and he started to work. And let me tell you, his work, it was smooth and fast. He did his measuring and his sawing and his nailing. And it was about sunset when old Joe returned and the carpenter had finished his work. And when old Joe pulled up in the wagon, his eyes opened wide and his mouth fell open. Because there wasn't a fence there at all. It was a bridge going from one side of the creek to the other. It had handrails and all, a fine piece of work. And his neighbor was just starting to cross the other side of that bridge with his hands stuck out. And he was saying, "Joe, you're quite a fellow to build this bridge. I'd have never been able to do that. I'm so glad we're going to be friends again." Then Joe, he put his arms around his neighbor and he said, "Oh, that calf is yours. I've known it all the time. I just want to be your friend too." About that time, the carpenter started putting his tools in the box, and then hoisted it up onto his shoulder, and he started to walk away. And Joe said, "No, wait, come back. I want you to stay on. I have lots of projects for you." And the carpenter just smiled and said, "You know, I'd like to stay on, Joe, but you see, I can't. I've got more bridges to build." And so he walked on, and there ends the tale.
We now come to the moment in our service when we ask you to make a financial contribution to our church. Your generosity helps to defray UUCY's operating expenses and also helps out organizations in our community that are engaged in work that is in keeping with our Unitarian Universalist principles and values. Our Share the Plate partner during the month of June is the Pennsylvania Immigration Resource Center, also known as PIRC. PIRC is a nonprofit organization which provides free legal aid to immigration detainees held by ICE at the York County Prison and the Berks County Family Detention Center. PIRC worked with UUCY to support our previously sponsored immigrant, Cho, who is now living in Harrisburg. A group of us were fortunate to gather in the Labyrinth last Tuesday to hear his moving personal story. PIRC also serves immigrants in Pennsylvania who are victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, and other violent crimes, and provides assistance to individuals seeking to become U.S. citizens through the naturalization process. We ask that you please be generous as you can. No donation is too small. Your financial gifts will be used wisely and well. Let us return to ourselves and become wholly ourselves. Let us be aware of the source of being, common to us all and to all living things. Evoking the presence of the great compassion, let us fill our hearts with our own compassion towards ourselves and towards all living beings. Let us pray that we ourselves cease to be the cause of suffering to each other. With humility, with awareness of the existence of life and of the sufferings that are going on around us, let us practice the establishment of peace in our hearts and on earth. Thus ends our reading.
Every June 6th, I think of my father. I think of his stories about landing in Normandy just a few days after the June 6th D-Day landing. I think of his being wounded and nearly killed when his armored car was destroyed by a German artillery piece. I think of him being decorated in the Battle of the Bulge for delivering hot food to troops on the front line during bitter cold weather. Only my father would receive a medal for delivering soup. And I think of my dad in the British Army group that in late 1945 liberated the German concentration camp at Bergen-Belsen in northern Germany. That's the concentration camp where the diarist Anne Frank had died of typhus just a few months before. The diary of Anne Frank is one of the most heartbreaking stories of World War II. A young teenager who was Jewish and kept a diary from June 12th of 1942 until she was arrested by the Nazis on August 1st of 1944, and she and her family were shipped off to Auschwitz. An entry in Anne's diary on June 6th of 1944 reveals that she did hear the news of the D-Day landings from the BBC. Is this really the beginning of the long-awaited liberation, Anne wrote in her diary? We don't know yet, but where there's hope, there's life. It fills us with fresh courage and makes us strong again. In October of 1944, Anne Frank was transferred from Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen, where she died in February, as I just mentioned. If you're a member of the baby boomer generation, as I am, chances are that you grew up hearing stories of the Second World War from your parents or grandparents. And June the 6th would have been a day of celebration of those landings, parades and marches, airplanes flying over to celebrate that momentous day when the liberation of Europe began, 77 years ago today. As the number of surviving veterans wanes, so do the number of parades and remembrances, and fewer news stories commenting on that momentous day appear on our screens, so it seems. I don't know how many Generation Xers and Millennials are even aware of the significance of June 6th, but I'm sure that it is far fewer than we baby boomers who grew up with war stories around our dining room tables. And I would be remiss if I did not pause to remember those who died on D-Day. Altogether, on that day, June 6th, around 4,400 Allied soldiers were killed. From the records of the war cemeteries in Normandy, it's estimated that within just a few days of the landings, over 110,000 people lost their lives. Of these, almost 78,000 men were German. Almost 18,000 were British. Over 9,000 were American. 5,000 were Canadian. And 650 Polish heroes also died. And that doesn't include the countless unnamed, unknown French civilians who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. For all of the war stories that I heard from my father as a kid growing up, the one thing that he seldom spoke about was the horrors he saw at Bergen-Belsen, where he was stationed for several months after the war was ended. A few years ago, I found a book called D-Day Through German Eyes. It was written by the grandson of a German journalist who covered the German troops in Normandy and wrote articles for the German Army Monthly magazine. That German journalist interviewed many of the survivors of D-Day 10 years after the fact in 1954. And the book D-Day Through German Eyes by Holger Eckertz, one that I really enjoyed reading, recounts the suffering and the horrors that the Germans experienced at the hands of the Allies. I grew up seeing war movies and hearing war stories. I never, until I read this book, thought about what it must have been like for the German defenders. And the thing that really struck me from this book was not so much the grisly, horrible stories of carnage, but the reasons the German troops believed they were fighting for. They had been led to believe that they were fighting to defend a united Europe. The propaganda they were fed told them that Britain and America were aggressors trying to divide Europe up again. I wonder if they hadn't believed that propaganda, whether they would have so bravely given their lives to defend something that was so blatantly false. And the irony is, for me, that 75 years later, one of those liberators, my country of origin, Great Britain, voted to leave a united Europe. So ironic and so tragic. Our sixth Unitarian Universalist principle is to affirm and promote the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. I know that my dad felt that by volunteering to serve, he was fighting for peace. How do we who are civilians act to prevent war and act to end wars from being? Mary Oliver's poem speaks of the rhythm of Eskimo life, hunting, cooking, sharing meals. And her poem suggests, maybe a bit too romantically, that by living simply, at one with nature, we can rid ourselves of our human tendency for war. I wonder if there's a way that we can emulate the rhythm of life experienced by these native peoples so that we too can look scornfully on the very idea of conflict. How might we build peace to the rhythm of life and not to the rhythm of the drums of war? There's an interconnectedness between those who engage in spreading the word of peace and doing peace work and those who actually do the work of peace. By doing small things, we can affect important outcomes and the work of important people. Many of you know that the Russian writer Leo Tolstoy wrote those great novels, War and Peace and Anna Karenina. But few know that Tolstoy also wrote about peace and a culture of peace and anti-war. A book that he wrote called A Confession describes his philosophy of nonviolence. Tolstoy wrote that book at the end of the 19th century. 50 years later and beyond, that book was deeply, deeply influential on people like Mohandas Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela. Gandhi wrote, "There's nothing worth killing for, but there are many things worth dying for." You don't have to be a Mandela or a Gandhi to work for peace. There are many ways we can do the work of peace through public witness, advocacy, our social justice work. We can write letters. We can become peace activists in other ways. Some of you may remember a young girl named Samantha Reed Smith. She was an American schoolgirl who in 1982 became famous for writing a letter to Yuri Andropov, who had recently become the head of state of the Soviet Union. She wrote this letter. Dear Mr. Andropov, my name is Samantha Smith. I'm 10 years old. Congratulations on your new job. I've been worrying about Russia and the United States getting into a nuclear war. Are you going to vote to have a war or not? If you aren't, please tell me how you're going to help to not have a war. And you don't have to answer this question, but I would like it if you would. Why do you want to conquer the world, or at least our country? God made the world for us to share and take care of, not to fight over or have one group of people own it all. Please let's do what he wanted and have everybody be happy too. Samantha's letter was written in the Soviet newspaper Pravda, but initially she did not receive a reply from Mr. Andropov. So undaunted, she wrote again to the Soviet ambassador to the United States, asking if she would get a reply. A few months later, she did receive a reply from Soviet President Andropov. Dear Samantha, I received your letter, which is like many others that have reached me recently from your country and from other countries around the world. It seems to me, I can tell by your letter, that you are a courageous and honest girl, resembling Becky, the friend of Tom Sawyer, in the famous book of your compatriot, Mark Twain. This book is well known and loved in our country by all boys and girls. You write that you are anxious about whether there will be a nuclear war between our two countries, and you ask, are we doing anything so that war will not break out?
If it does start to go, you know.
Your question is the most important of those
I'm
that
thinking
every
it shouldn't be
thinking
too
person
hard for
can
you to
pose.
either
I will
just
reply to
cut
you
it.
seriously and honestly. Yes, Samantha, we in the Soviet Union are trying to do everything so that there will not be a war on Earth. This is what every Russian person wants. This is what the founder of our state, Vladimir Lenin, taught us. Soviet people well know what a terrible thing war is. In America and in our country, there are nuclear weapons, terrible weapons that can kill millions of people in an instant, but we do not want them ever to be used. We want peace. That is something we are occupied with. Growing wheat, building and inventing, writing books and flying into space. We want peace for ourselves.
I don't know how
all
fast
I could put more rocks
you can.
around it.
Andropov ended his
I mean,
letter to
you will just
Samantha
go
by
over
inviting
anything,
her
right?
for a visit to the Soviet Union, and she certainly went and spent some time there. It was a great,
I just
great
don't
media event. And unfortunately, sadly,
But I mean, it's right
Samantha
there.
lost
so
her life in a plane crash 2 years later. Stories like Samantha Smith's are rare, but powerful. Her story reminds us that simply by writing a letter, one can have a profound impact on the work of securing peace. There are so many people whose names are not well known who've done the work of peace. I lift up the American Jesuit priest Daniel Berrigan, the first priest ever to land on the FBI's most wanted list. He and his brother were imprisoned for 3 years by using napalm to set fire to over 300 draft cards outside the draft board in Maryland. They wrote a public statement after the incident. We confront the Roman Catholic Church, other Christian bodies, and the synagogues of America with their silence and cowardice in the face of our country's crimes. We are convinced that the religious bureaucracy in this country is racist, is an accomplice in the Vietnam War, and is hostile to the poor. Advocacy, public witness. These are things that we can do as Unitarian Universalists in the furtherance of the cause of peace. On this 77th anniversary of the D-Day landings, let us pray that we can continue this work. Let us write letters, let us march, let us show up for peace everywhere. Because we may not see the immediate results of that work, but I believe that that work will have an impact on the work of peace. May it be so. Blessed be. Amen.
We invite those at home who lit their own chalice candle to extinguish it at this time, as we read aloud the words for extinguishing our chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
Our closing words are by Mother Teresa. I was once asked, she wrote, why I don't participate in anti-war demonstrations. I said that I will never do that, but as soon as you have a pro-peace rally, I'll be there. Thank you for being with us this morning, all of you folks who joined us from home. 2 weeks from now, we will have a almost regular in-person service. I don't know that we'll have room for everybody, but we will have room for a lot more people than were here for our last in-person worship service. And we'll send you information about the number of people who can be in attendance on our June 20th service and how to reserve a spot in the sanctuary. But until then, thank you for being here. Go in peace, go in love, go in joy. May your roots grow deep, may your branches grow wide. Our worship is over. Our service now begins. Blessed be. Amen. Go lifted up, love bless your way. Moonlight, starlight, guide your journey into peace. And the brightness of day